All right, welcome back. I'm going to begin with a review of the last lecture. Last time we discussed how the four elementary psychological models serve as the basis for structuring social relations. And these elementary models are communal sharing, which is focusing on something that you have in common. Authority ranking, which is appreciation of ordered differences. Equality matching, which is correcting or avoiding additive imbalances. And market pricing, which is coordinating interaction according to ratios. And social interactions on every scale are analyzable into these four basic psychological models. Now, the classic definition, the traditional definition of social cognition is that it is person perception, most especially what's known as theory of mind or folk psychology or mind reading, all three of those being the same thing. Mind reading simply means that the individual infers what the other individual is thinking by looking at their facial expression, looking at their behavior, or even just listening to what they have to say, which is also a kind of behavior, verbal behavior. That's known as mind reading. Okay. So, in other words, ascribing mental states, usually construed as beliefs and desires, to others to understand and predict their behavior. Now, a number of psychological studies have confirmed that the four models of relational models theory play a significant role in person perception. In fact, the models are a better indicator of how one classifies persons than any other proposed typology, with the one exception, as you may recall, of gender. Now, what this means is that social cognition is fundamentally thinking about relations rather than thinking about persons. Thinking about persons turns out to be analyzable in terms of thinking about relations. So thinking about relations is the more basic thing. Now, and the way in which one thinks about relations is analyzable into these four elementary models. Now, at the very end of the last lecture, I mentioned something about, we touched on the topic of whether or not relational models theory is individualistic. Now that depends on what one means by the word individualistic, which is ambiguous. On page 280 of the article by Fisk and Haslam, The Four Basic Social Bonds, they remark that, and I'm quoting them, "We argue that relational models theory differs from many psychological approaches to the study of interpersonal cognition in taking a thoroughly relational approach, whereas many of its alternatives are implicitly or explicitly individualistic." Now, relational models theory is individualistic in one sense. It's individualistic in the sense that the models are psychological. The models are understood to be inside the individual's head. So when we talk about the models, we're talking about something inside a specific brain, a particular brain. So in that sense, relational models theory is highly individualistic. Now, when Fisk and Haslam deny that it's individualistic, what they're saying is that relational models theory is not a so-called selfish agent view. In other words, relational models theory does not assume that each of us chooses to interact with others in order to maximize one's own utility, which is a classic view in economics. I mean, economics is almost wholly structured by market pricing. It turns out that classical economics is an overextension of market pricing. But rather, on relational models theory, social relations are valued in themselves, they're recognized as intrinsically meaningful. Now the classic view of social cognition, namely that social cognition is theory of mind, that it's mind reading, that view is consistent with the selfish agent view. On that sort of view, one wants to maximize one's own individual utility, and one reads minds, so to speak. One infers the mental states of others in order to calculate how best to use others for one's own ends. Right? So that's the classic view of, well, that's classic economics, that's also the classic view of social cognition, but that's not what relational models theory is. On relational models theory, the relations are construed by the individual, they're construed by the person using the models, applying the models as intrinsically worthwhile. Communal sharing is worthwhile in itself. It's not a means to some end. It's not a means to the end of maximizing one's own utility. This also applies to market pricing. Market pricing is a value in itself. It's not done for the sake of something else, according to relational models theory. Now, this so far has been a review of the previous lecture. Now, moving on to a new topic, let's talk about recursive embedding, which was the topic of the reading that I had you do for today, the selection from Alan Page Fisk's book, Structures of Social Life. In the book, or in that passage, he talks about recursion, and then he talks about composition, and one might get the impression that they're two different things, but I believe that they're usefully construed as fundamentally the same thing, namely embedding. Composition is best understood as embedding, and recursion is also best understood as embedding. This is something that I'll explain as we go along. It'll unfold as we go along. Now, turning to Fisk's discussion, part of the complexity of social life is due to the embedding of one instance of a relational model within another instance of a relational model. This point was briefly illustrated earlier when we discussed the case of the parent deciding how best to reward their child. Now that is a combination of authority ranking and market pricing. The parent has authority over the child in deciding the best or the most suitable proportion for a reward. That's market pricing, because proportion means ratio, which is the core idea in market pricing. Now that was an illustration of composition, namely the combination of two different types of models, authority ranking and market pricing. It's also possible to embed a model of one certain type within a model of the same type, in other words, recursive embedding. Now, we can begin to illustrate this by discussing recursion in market pricing. And in order to do that, I want to discuss an early Greek philosopher, namely Thales of Miletus. There's a passage, a rather famous passage, in Aristotle's Politics, in which he tells us that Thales was a very good businessman, or at least legend has it that Thales was a good businessman, in addition to being a good philosopher / scientist. Quoting Aristotle, Thales was reproached for his poverty, which was supposed to show that philosophy was of no use. According to the story, Thales knew by his skill in the stars, while it was still winter, that there would be a great harvest of olives in the coming year. So, having a little money, he gave deposits for the use of all the olive presses in Chios and Miletus, which he hired at a low price because no one bid against him. When the harvest time came, and many were wanted all at once and of a sudden, he let them out at any rate which he pleased, and made a quantity of money. Thus he showed the world that philosophers can easily be rich if they like, but that their ambition is of another sort. And I'm sure that convinced all of you. any philosopher can be rich. They just don't want to be. Okay, so here we have an illustration of a series of contracts. That's what makes it recursive, a series of linked contracts. We have a contract between Thales and a customer, right, which is made possible by an earlier contract between Thales and the owner of a given olive press. And that contract was made possible by an earlier contract between Thales and the same owner, guaranteeing Thales that only Thales would have the right to contract for use of the press. So you have one contract referring to and enabling another contract, which refers and enables another contract. You have a chain of contracts. One finds similar chains of contracts in so-called option contracts and futures, which are which are examples given by Alan Fisk of recursion and market pricing in the reading that you did for today. Another example that Fisk gives of recursion and market pricing is the buying and selling of markets. Okay, in other words, franchises. So for years, I remember that the only brand of coffee available in Turkey from the United States was Nescafe. That may even still be true, I don't know. But the lack of variety was really striking. I mean, you would go down an aisle in the supermarket and you would look at coffee, and there might be some really hideous English coffee, and the only coffee from the U.S. you would see was Nescafe. You didn't see Folgers or Maxwell House or anything else, just Nescafe. Maybe a little bit of Sanka, but it was mainly Nescafe. Now, this was because Nescafe, or its parent company, had bought the coffee market, or at least they had bought a really large part of the coffee market from the Turkish government. Right? So a market which is structured by market pricing can itself be bought and sold, which is a superordinate instance of market pricing. So you have recursion and market pricing. But what do we mean by recursion? Recursion is an ambiguous term. There are two meanings that are relevant for this course. Both meanings are closely related, so for practical purposes we don't always have to distinguish them. Fisk uses the word recursion to mean the embedding of an object within an object of the same type. Recursion can also mean the application of a procedure to its own result. Now, these two meanings are related because the application of a procedure to its own result can produce a structure in which an object is embedded within an object of the same type. Okay? Now, so consider a set constructing operation in which 1, the symbol for 1, is combined with an object X, an object that we're not going to specify what it is. So 1 is combined with X to yield the set whose members are 1 and X. That's an operation. It's a set constructing operation. In fact, specifically, it is a binary set constructing operation because it acts upon two objects to form a set with precisely those two objects as its members. This binary set constructing operation is applied recursively if it's applied to its own result, which in this case would yield, well, given that it's a binary operation, it would yield a set containing precisely two members. One member is the symbol for 1, and the other member is unspecified. But given that we're talking about recursion, that second member will be the output of the first application of the procedure. Applying the operation to that result, in turn, yields a new result, namely 1, a set with two members. One member is the symbol for 1, and the other member is the output of the last application of the procedure. This is a recursive operation in the sense that it's applied to its own result. So it's recursive according to the second definition. But there is also something here that's recursive according to the first definition, namely the outputs are recursive according to the first definition. They're recursive with reference to their form. In each case, as a result of this operation, one has an object of the form 1x embedded within an object of the form 1x. So the x, in each case, turns out to be identical to the output from the previous application of the operation. So you have an object embedded within an object of the same type. Now, note that what I'm describing here is a particulate system in which 1 and x are primes. And I'm not including the brackets or the commas as primes because they simply indicate how the 1's and x's are grouped. In fact, it's possible that 1 is the only prime. 1 will be the only prime if x can somehow be analyzed in terms of instances of 1's. Now what makes this particulate is that combining primes into larger objects does not alter the intrinsic nature of any prime. By contrast, in a blending system, such as mixing paint, the intrinsic character of each type of paint would change during the process of mixing. Now, the natural numbers can be recursively defined. One can provide what's called a recursive definition for the set of natural numbers. You do this by beginning with the set consisting of 1 and 0. It has two members, 1 and 0. You interpret that set as 1. The semantic interpretation of the set is 1. Its meaning is the number 1. Now you can combine that set with 1, yielding the set whose members are 1 and the previous object. And you would interpret that set as meaning 2, and so on. I mean, the following set would have, again, precisely two members. One member would be the symbol for 1, and then its other member would be the object that was just formed, and you would interpret that as 3. So one begins with the set having two members, 1 and 0. Well, actually, a question may occur to you, right? Why is it that we started with a set consisting of two members, 1 and 0? Why not just start with a set consisting of one member only, namely the symbol for 1? The answer is that in order to make this as simple as possible, we want to use the same procedure all the way through. And the procedure is a binary set constructing operation. It's an operation that yields a set having exactly two members and no more. If we began with a unit set, such as a set consisting only of the number 1, if we began with that, then we would have to appeal to a unary operation at the first step. And from that point on, we would switch over to a binary operation. And you may say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, there may not be anything wrong with that, but it's simpler to have a binary operation all the way through, because that way you have the same operation all the way through. Yeah. Now, the fact that the set of natural numbers can be defined recursively, and the fact that one finds recursion in social cognition, raises the question of how they might be related. It also raises the question of whether or not they actually are related. Could one be an outgrowth of the other? Or is it possible that both recursion in counting and recursion in social cognition result from recursion in some third mental capacity? That's a big question for the course. It's not a question that we're going to entirely deal with right now. It's a question that I'm raising that we're going to return to a number of times during the course of this semester. Now, let's continue with examples of recursion in interpersonal cognition before we go back to the topic of counting. The recursive embedding of an instance of market pricing within another instance of market pricing may be represented as the following. You have a superordinate instance of market pricing, and then a subordinate set whose two members are an instance of market pricing, and another set whose members are an instance of market pricing, and this undefined placeholder X. X here plays a role that's analogous to the role of 0 in the recursive definition of natural number. And again, the only motivation for putting the X in there is to avoid positing two operations, a unary operation and a binary operation. We can have the same operation running all the way through if we put some placeholder in at the very first step, so that the very first application of the operation is binary. Now, that may seem a little mysterious, and you may wonder what X is, or even if there is an X. That question we'll return to next week, because that very same question arises with regard to language. It turns out that language is also recursive. And that raises the question, perhaps you saw this coming, that raises the question of whether recursion in social cognition might be an offshoot of recursion in language. There's also the question of whether recursion in counting is an offshoot of recursion in language. These are really deep questions. In fact, they're pretty much the central questions of the course. At the very least, those are questions that we're going to return to again and again. And right now, I'm simply raising those questions. And I am acknowledging that the letter X there is a bit pesky and mysterious. And we do need to figure out what's going on. But for now, let's just take it for granted that there's a mysterious X there. The same issue arises with regard to language, recursion in language. Now, I was talking about recursion in market pricing. Now let's talk about recursion in equality matching. The example of equality matching which Fisk gives in the reading that you did for today is, it had to do with a social institution known as rotating credit associations, which I find just a little bit, I mean, I know what he's talking about, and I'm sure you know what he's talking about too, but there's something a little bit awkward about that example. I think a more intuitive example is found in Anton Pannekoek's discussion of council communism. I think it's also good to discuss this because I was just discussing market pricing and futures and options and so forth, and I want to emphasize that recursion is ubiquitous in social cognition. It's ubiquitous in cognition about society. So you will find it in capitalism, you will find it in communism, you will find it in medieval feudalism, you find it just, I mean, potentially it's everywhere, okay? And what that illustrates is that there's something very fundamental going on here. It's not something that changes from one culture to another or one society to another. It's ubiquitous and apparently, evidently, something very deep in human nature. It seems to be, right? So Pannekoek was an astronomer and also a political theorist who advocated a highly democratic form of communism. which happens to have a strikingly recursive structure. Okay. Now, on Pannekoek's conception of a worthwhile society, the marketplace, or the workplace rather, sorry, not the marketplace, that was a slip. The workplace is organized according to equality matching, and to quote Pannekoek here, the great task of the workers is the organization of production on a new basis. It has to begin with the organization within the shop, that's the workplace. Collaboration of equal companions replaces the command of masters and the obedience of servants. So he's emphasizing that he's describing a system in which equality matching has replaced and displaced authority ranking. Now, according to Pannekoek, according to his description of the kind of society he wants or wanted, a council of workers democratically decides what its interests are. And this council chooses a delegate who represents them in a superordinate council, which is also structured by equality matching. And he describes measures which are taken to prevent any authority ranking relation emerging between the delegate and their constituents. And to continue with the quote, the delegates constituting them, that is the superordinate councils, the delegates constituting these superordinate councils have been sent by sectional assemblies with special instructions. They return to these assemblies to report on the discussion and its results. In other words, they're held accountable to their lower level council. Delegates are quickly rotated. The choice of delegate will sometimes reflect the nature of the council's immediate concern. And a delegate can be withdrawn at any time if they do not represent the interests of the subordinate council which they represent. So you have here a hierarchical layering of councils with equality matching structuring all the councils, and steps being taken to avoid a relation of authority ranking between a superordinate council and a subordinate council. So you have here a recursive embedding of equality matching, just as in the case of Thales, you had a recursive embedding of market pricing. So, now to look at this in a very abstract, formal way, which is perhaps not the sort of thing one is accustomed to in discussions of communism, which are normally very emotional. But let's look at this in a very abstract way. Each conceivable communist society has a finite number of recursions. In other words, there's a finite number of levels of councils. Right. However, there is no greatest conceivable number of levels. For any conceivable council communist society, no matter how many levels there are in that society, one could always conceive or imagine another council communist society with an extra level. Okay? So the set of all possible communist societies is infinite, even though the structure of any given communist society is finite. And this is analogous to the natural numbers. Each natural number is finite. However, there is no greatest natural number. No matter how great a natural number is, there's another natural number that's one greater. I mean, that number plus one. Okay? Therefore, the set of all natural numbers is infinite. So, there's some kind of formal similarity or analogy between the set of natural numbers and the set of all possible communist societies. Of course, these remarks are not limited to council communism. They're not limited to equality matching. They also apply to market pricing. They apply to authority ranking and communal sharing, which we haven't discussed yet. The point here is that there is something in social cognition that is very number-like, that may strike you as trivial, But I don't think it's trivial, because the point here is to understand how the human mind works. Why do we count? And why do we have, why do our social arrangements exhibit this wide array of diversity? Other species don't exhibit unbounded counting. We've tried. I mean, scientists have tried to teach unbounded counting to other species, and they've never been able to do it, even though they've tried very hard. Other species don't exhibit unbounded counting. Other species, for any given species, they don't exhibit a wide range of social structures like we do. We can form capitalist societies and communist societies and feudalist societies, and then we can start arguing about which one's better, and get angry. But what's really interesting here, the really basic thing, is that we're even able to do that at all. I mean, you don't find such options among Caledonian crows, for example, or even gorillas, right, or baboons. So maybe there's some connection here. Maybe our ability to imagine and to form so many different kinds of societies, and our ability to count, maybe those two things are connected in some deep level. And the question is, well, one question is what they are, and if so, how? What is the connection? Okay. So, well, this just reiterates a point I just made. There's a possibility of a deep connection between counting and social cognition. Okay. Now, let's go on to discuss recursion in authority ranking. It's very easy to imagine, because recursion in authority ranking is simply a hierarchical ranking of hierarchical rankings. And one illustration of this, which I find rather colorful, is this medieval concept of the great chain of being. Now, the great chain of being, well, primarily it illustrates the projection of authority ranking upon all of nature. More to the point, more particularly, it illustrates recursion in authority ranking. According to this great chain of being, this medieval notion, each type of being has its place in a ranking, with God at the very top and earth or stone being at the very bottom. Each step in the chain adds some excellence to the category in question. So, for example, or to be more specific, earth exists. Soil, it just exists, and that's all. Plants exist too, but in addition to existing, plants are alive. So that's an extra degree of excellence in plants. Animals exist, and they are alive, and they also have a principle of self-motion. So there's an added excellence for animals. Humans have all those things, and they also have the capacity for reason, and so on. Then angels are above humans, and God is above angels. Okay. However, what makes this recursive is that there's a ranking within each category as well. So minerals, for example, can be ranked. Gold is superior to lead. Obviously, this is terrible science. No one would say that nowadays, but in the Middle Ages, it made sense to say that gold is superior to lead. You could rank gold above lead. Yeah. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, well, is that really authority ranking? I mean, after all, gold doesn't give orders to lead, right? Lead doesn't pay its respects to gold. Minerals don't stand in social relations to each other. However, among human beings, there is also a ranking. There's a chain of being among humans. And that's an illustration of authority ranking. And it is a subordinate authority ranking in relation to the great chain of being as a whole. Now, one illustration of this, which I find pretty interesting, is from Shakespeare's play Macbeth. This is actually kind of my own interpretation of what Macbeth is about. I think Macbeth is actually about the chain of being. And the problem, or the so-called argument, as it were, of the play, is that the chain of being has been violated, but it's been violated on the human level. Macbeth rose to the rank of Thane. It was within his innate potential to rise to that rank. And that's as high as he should have gone. He should only have been a Thane. But instead, he murders the king, Duncan, and he takes Duncan's place. That violated the great chain of being, even though it only occurred on a human level. Now, to illustrate this, the nobleman Lennox in the play describes some very bizarre and unhappy events that occur on the night of the murder. Without even knowing that the murder has occurred, Lennox remarks, "The night has been unruly. Where we lay, our chimneys are blown down. New hatched to the woeful time, the obscure bird clamored the livelong night. Some say the earth was feverous and did shake." In killing Duncan, Macbeth violated the great chain of being. He somehow contradicted it, did something that clashed with it. And as a result, nature is sick. Nature is ill. The earth itself has a fever. Now, you may be wondering if this really is recursion, because in order for it to be recursion, there must be at least two orderings. There must be a superordinate ordering and at least one subordinate ordering, such as an ordering within a species. But couldn't one say that there's just a single ordering and that types of humans belong to that single ordering? In that case, it wouldn't really be recursive. Could one say that? Well, I don't think so, because the fact that this is genuinely recursive emerges later in the play. Once he becomes king, and by the way, that's Orson Welles as Macbeth. That's supposed to be a crown on his head, I guess. Orson Welles here. Or there. Not here, there. Once he becomes king, Macbeth defends the chain of being. Because once he's sitting on the throne, it's in his interest to do that. And he also defends the subordinate occurrence of the chain of being within a particular species. Now, what Macbeth does in Act 3 of the play is, excuse me, what Macbeth does is to distinguish two orderings. And when he uses the word catalog or file, he's referring to orderings. You can think of a file as being like a filing cabinet. Now, on one file or catalog, differences within a species are ignored. And according to another file or catalog, differences within a species are listed, they are noticed. So what he's indicating is that you can just look at the great chain of being as a ranking of species. That's one file, that's one catalog. You can also look at the catalog that opens up the species and distinguishes its members. And that really does look recursive. It looks like a ranking of rankings. So to quote Macbeth, he says, he's speaking to two potential assassins whom he's hiring. "I and the catalogue ye go for men, as hounds and greyhounds, mongrels, spaniels, curs, shuffs, water rugs, and demi-wolves are clept all by the name of dogs. The valued file distinguishes the swift, the slow, the subtle, the housekeeper, the hunter, every one according to the gift which bounteous nature hath in him closed, whereby he does receive particular addition from the bill that writes them all alike, and so of men." In other words, There's the bill, which writes them all alike. That's the superordinate ordering. And then there is the bill which bestows particular addition, and that's the subordinate ordering. Furthermore, despite the reference to dogs, this is authority ranking, because Macbeth is asserting his authority over those to whom he speaks, while he's also drawing attention to their base criminal character. Now, as we discuss the chain of being here, one might be thinking, well, there is no chain of being, right? That's just a medieval fiction. And I would agree with that. As an aside, a brief aside, it's somewhat disturbing that when people talk about evolutionary biology, and I'm not talking about biologists who would know better, but when other people talk about evolutionary biology, they sometimes make the mistake of thinking that it's a biological explanation of the chain of being, that evolution moves in a direction. And that leads to funny questions like, well, if humans evolved from apes, then why are there still apes? That misunderstands evolution, which has nothing to do with the chain of being. There is no chain of being. There's no chain of being in Darwin. There's no chain of being in Dawkins. There's just no chain of being. Okay? Right? So this is a medieval fiction. Of course, it can be traced back to Plato and Aristotle, but it was last taken seriously in the Middle Ages, at least I hope. It's a medieval fiction, so one might think, well, there is no chain of being. But when I talk about authority ranking and the chain of being, I'm talking about what happens in people's minds. People sometimes think in terms of a chain of being. And this underscores the point that the relational models are psychological. They're in people's heads. They make a difference to the external world. They're prompted by things in the external world, and they have an effect on the external world. But the models themselves exist in the mind. And when we talk about recursion in the relational models, we are talking about recursion in the mind. We're talking about something psychological. So the fact that angels and God may not exist does not alter the point I've been making about it, the chain of being and authority ranking. Now, turning to communal sharing, let's consider an example in Fisk. Fisk discussed the recursive structuring of communal sharing among the Mose of Burkina Faso. Now, Mose society consists of units organized according to communal sharing. Each unit is known as a buudu. On the most subordinate level, on the lowest level, a buudu is a polygamous family. Now, this polygamous family forms a larger grouping known as a zaka. The zaka live together, they eat together, and they cultivate land together. They share living space, food, and work. A number of zakas belong to the same sublineage, which is also organized by communal sharing. A number of sublineages belong to the same lineage. A number of lineages form a superordinate structure, which is also called a buudu, which is protected by a common totem. A number of these superordinate buudus constitute an ethnic subgroup, and a number of ethnic subgroups constitute the Mose people as a whole. And so you have here a nested recursive structure being informed by communal sharing at each level. Now, quoting Fisk, each represents, in other words, each level represents in ever-decreasing intensity and a more limited range of domains as they expand a communal sharing relationship. So the innermost group shares most of their labor and food, while intermediate groups share food and labor occasionally. Now, in principle, this could go on forever, this recursive embedding. Presumably, any imaginable social structure will be finite. It seems a little bizarre to say that one could imagine an infinitely layered social structure. In principle, any one is finite, but there is no greatest number of layers. So no matter how layered a conceivable society is, there's always some other society that has one additional layer. Right? So the total number of societies structured by communal sharing is potentially infinite. But you might question this. You might say, well, is it really infinite? I mean, after all, the communal sharing bonds grow weaker on each level as you go up. And wouldn't that force termination at some point? And might it not even be possible to predict what that point would be based on our knowledge of how the bonds weaken? Right? One thing that's important to keep in mind here is that we're not talking about external limitations, such as limitations on food, right, or limitations on the size of land or the fertility of the soil or something like that, because we're talking about something psychological, we're talking about something in the mind. The focus here is on mental representation, something internal. However, one could point out that there are psychological limitations. There are, for example, emotional limitations. But notice that the same thing would also apply to counting. There are psychological limitations on your ability to perform arithmetic in your head. And the fact that there are such limitations does not change the fact that your knowledge of arithmetic generates, that is, it specifies, the class of natural numbers. I'm talking about simple arithmetic. We're not getting into fractions yet. Because your knowledge of very elementary arithmetic defines the set of natural numbers. It defines an infinite set, even though there are practical limitations on your ability to calculate in your head. That doesn't change the fact that in some sense you grasp an infinite set of numbers. Likewise here, the fact that there are some psychological limitations on your ability to imagine a complex social structure does not mean that the procedure that you're using to recursively define social structures fails to specify an infinite set of social structures. If it did mean that, then it would also follow that your knowledge of the basic rules of arithmetic failed to specify the set of natural numbers. And that's not true. So there is some sense in which your social competence, your knowledge of social relations, specifies an infinite set of possible social structures. Okay. The point that I've just made is the distinction between competence and performance. Competence is knowledge, and performance is what one does with the knowledge. A limitation on performance is not necessarily a limitation on competence. Later this term, we'll be discussing the article by George Miller, or the selection by George Miller. That selection is primarily concerned with this distinction, the distinction between performance and competence. So that's an issue that we'll return to. Now, so we'll talk about that later. Right now, I want to point out an interesting property of these recursive structures. And to do that, I want to go back to Pannekoek. Now, I was discussing Pannekoek's council communism in terms of the recursive embedding of structures informed by equality matching. That is only part of the society which Pannekoek was advocating. This recursive structuring of councils, that compound structure is itself united and bound together by an ethos of communal sharing. So, Pannekoek speaks of, quote, a humanity that has bound itself consciously by strong ties of brotherhood into a working community controlling its own life. So it turns out that this compound equality matching structure is subordinate to an overarching structure of communal sharing, an overarching ethos of communal sharing. But this only includes the workers. In the early stages of a council communist society, it's only the workers who live in these councils, or who operate in these councils, and who are bound together by an ethos of communal sharing. Only them. The stockholders and the rentiers are outside of the system. Sorry here. They're outside the system because they don't constitute workers' councils. So the workers, they control the stockholders, they control the former bourgeoisie in order to prevent them from regaining power. So the workers as a whole exhibit authority ranking over the bourgeoisie or the former bourgeoisie. So you have a higher level instance of authority ranking. This is Pannekoek's conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and I wasn't able to get the full image there, so I cut off part of the word, but you know what that says. So what that means is that we not only have recursion here, recursive embedding, we also have what Fiske calls composition, the combination of models belonging to different types. Now here is something that I think is really, really interesting. Given what I've just described, probably when you look at this and think about it, you're tempted to say something like, well, it's really authority ranking. A dictatorship is what it really is. And you'll notice that that corresponds to the highest level of this parsing tree, the tree that reveals the embedded structure of the social relations. Intuitively, you look at it and you think, well, that's really authority ranking. That's what it really is. Even though there are subordinate elements that fit different categories, such as communal sharing and equality matching. Now, as you may recall from Marx 101 or whatever, theoretically at some point the government withers away because after a generation or two there no longer is a bourgeoisie. They're gone, and their children or grandchildren no longer have a bourgeois identity. They become workers. In that case, you no longer need a government, theoretically. Now, if that were to happen, then the authority ranking level would disappear, and you would only have the structure to the right with communal sharing at the top, and these equality matching structures subordinate to it. If that were to happen, then intuitively, what sort of society would you have? You would think of it as communal sharing, even though there are subordinate equality matching components. You would think of it primarily as communal sharing. Now, this illustrates a point that was made by William Abler in the article that you read for the first lecture. From page 4 of his article, Abler writes, to the extent that organization at higher levels has a tendency to obscure constituents at lower levels, the levels of organization have a tendency to act as shells which enclose and hide their constituents. Abler is making a very general point. He's making a point about nature itself. But notice that the same thing is true psychologically. Psychologically, you tend to focus on the most superordinate level. And that's how you label the entire structure. In other words, and this is because the highest level of organization tends to determine the behavior of the entire system in a disproportionate way. Lower levels have a tendency to be obscured and remain invisible. Abler's illustration of this, or one of his illustrations, are sand dunes. On a micro level, on a very small level, a sand dune is a particulate system because it consists of particles. But on a superordinate level, it's not a particulate system. It looks more like a blending system. It's analog because you find continuity. These undulating shapes exhibit continuity. Now, I want to give you another example. Actually, I want to bring up the notion of licensing. A superordinate instance of a model serves to license or authorize a subordinate instance. And let's consider an example. Oh, I'll skip that. Here we are. Imagine a very fancy traditional restaurant in a libertarian society. Now, let me say something that's going to sound naive, but it sounds naive. Well, it's interesting as to why it sounds naive, but let me just say it. Okay, now here we are in a libertarian society. Everyone is free, and people enter into agreements with each other, based on their, from a basis of non-coercion. However, within this libertarian society, you have this fancy restaurant, and there's a waiter and a customer. And the relation between the waiter and the customer is obviously authority ranking. After all, the waiter acts as a servant to the customer. And the customer even shows some pastoral concern for the subservient waiter by leaving a tip. But, obviously, authority ranking clashes with the ethos of a libertarian society. So, shouldn't this be forbidden? Well, and the answer, of course, is no, obviously not. It's perfectly permissible, provided that both parties have freely entered into an agreement authorizing them to play such roles. Now, here's the point that I want to make. The important point here is that one level in the hierarchical structure authorizes or licenses the arrangement appearing on the next level down. So yes, it's true that this is authority ranking. And it's true that this occurs in a society that's structured by an ethos of libertarianism, which is market pricing. But that's fine, because this man freely agreed to be a waiter. He entered into a contract with the patron or boss of the restaurant that he would do this. And the customer freely entered the restaurant and agreed to play this role. Because of that agreement, this is okay. There's nothing wrong with it. That illustrates the same point. It's the superordinate label that determines how one categorizes the entire structure. And in this case, market pricing is superordinate, even though there's a subordinate element of authority ranking. Given the tip, one even has a more complex structure, because the tip involves a ratio, right? You take the tax and double it, that's a ratio. So the resulting structure would have the form market pricing, superordinate to authority ranking, superordinate to market pricing. In the case of the judicial system, you have market pricing in the verdict rendered by the judge, which is a kind of proportion, but that's licensed by the judge's authority. So authority ranking here licenses the subordinate use of market pricing. Okay. And we're pretty much out of time. I have a few more points I want to make. I'll get to those points next time. So let me just skip over some beautiful slides here. For next week, please read The Faculty of Language by Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch. Now, the focus in that article is language, but you will also notice that it's really primarily about recursion and cognition, which is what we've just been talking about. And the authors also discuss counting. So this article reflects upon the issue of unbounded counting and recursion in language, which may be related to recursion in social cognition. That's the question. So please read that article for next time. And any questions, if you have them, please email me, and I'll see you next time. Bye.